Coming this fall from SJS Direct, Easting the Sands of Time. It's action, adventure, and romance in ancient Egypt in this fantasy flashback Easting series adventure. Pre-order Easting the Sands of Time today on Amazon.com. At the end of this fiscal year, many Star Wars fans thought that Bob Iger, the CEO of Disney, was going to terminate Kathleen Kennedy based on the poor performance of Solo, a Star Wars story at the box office, which was the first Star Wars flop. And they also thought that Bob Iger was going to terminate Kathleen Kennedy based on the negative reception of The Last Jedi the year before and the completely negative reaction to The Last Jedi from longtime fans and new Star Wars fans, in addition to the complete collapse of Star Wars merchandise at retail, one of the reasons why Toys R Us went out of business. However, in spite of this completely negative record, your Bob Iger has decided to double down, and he has decided to keep Kathleen Kennedy on as the head of Lucasfilm. Now, this is a mind-boggling decision as I see it, because when you take a look at the direction of Star Wars under Kathleen Kennedy, Star Wars has gone into a complete free fall. And instead of fans being enthusiastic for new Star Wars movies, what's been happening is people have become alienated from the whole Star Wars brand, the whole Star Wars lore, and they want nothing to do with Star Wars anymore. And it's clear that under Kathleen Kennedy's leadership, we have gone from telling the type of stories that Star Wars fans want to read and see on screen, with featuring classic characters and classic Star Wars lore, to a Star Wars which is filled with identity politics, Mary Sue characters, and one-dimensional storytelling and character development, storytelling that in many cases makes absolutely no sense, like the incoherent mess we got in The Last Jedi and the complete incoherent mess we got in Solo, a Star Wars story. So when I take a critical look at the direction of Star Wars, it's clear that they need new leadership at Lucasfilm. But Bob Iger, instead of going to try to find new leadership to replace Kathleen Kennedy and give Star Wars fans a feeling of security and a vote of confidence that we can trust him to take Star Wars in a new direction, instead decides to stay with Kathleen Kennedy and in some ways give a middle finger to hundreds of millions of Star Wars fans across the globe. And when I look at Bob Iger's actions, they smack more of gynocentrism than being a professional. Because when I look at Bob Iger's actions, instead of him holding Kathleen Kennedy, the staunch feminist, to an equal account for her own actions, instead, your Bob Iger decides to deflect from Kathleen Kennedy's complete mismanagement of the Star Wars brand. And how he deflects from Kathleen Kennedy's complete mismanagement is by making the excuse that it wasn't the stories or the ideas that Kathleen Kennedy proposed, it was about them releasing too many movies in one time period. Now, I don't believe that it was the amount of movies that came out in a particular time period that led to the complete collapse of Star Wars. No, it was the gynocentrism and the feminism and the identity politics pushed in many of those movies. Because when people looked at Rogue One, they had no problem with Jyn Erso and many of the characters in Rogue One. What they had, because the story stayed true to the Star Wars lore and led up to events in Episode 4. But what they had a problem with was all of the identity politics and social justice agendas pushed in movies like The Last Jedi, like The Force Awakens, and like Solo, a Star Wars story. Because when you look at those movies and you compare them to the original trilogy and even the dreadful prequel trilogy, you really don't see any quality as related to storytelling. Instead of us getting rich, multidimensional characters we cared about, instead we got avatars for Kathleen Kennedy because the Ray character was nothing more than a Mary Sue designed to be an avatar for Kathleen Kennedy and push her narrative as related to strong women. And many of the other characters, like Finn and Rose Tico, had paper thin character development, and much of the storytelling was really absolutely horrific because as I watched The Last Jedi on Netflix, I felt like I was watching a sci fi version of a Tyler Perry movie. And when it comes down to your Tyler Perry, he had the excuse that he was a completely inexperienced filmmaker who had never gone to film school and never gotten any film training and did not understand how to do things like frame a shot or how to direct his actors. But when it comes down to Kathleen Kennedy, she's supposed to have had decades of experience as a producer, and with decades of experience as a producer and billions of dollars behind her, there really was no excuse for what she put on the screen in those dreadful movies that she called Star Wars movies. Now, when it comes down to Bob Iger's decision to retain Kathleen Kennedy, what Star Wars fans have to do is not react to it, they have to respond to it. Because Star Wars fans have been responding in the right way to your Kathleen Kennedy's bad decisions by voting with their wallets. And as I see it, many Star Wars fans have to do what I did when Dan Didio decided he wanted to take DC Comics in the direction of the New 52. And what they have to do is continue to keep their wallets closed. Because when Dan Didio decided to end the classic DC universe and alienate many DC Comics fans like myself, what I said was, instead of me getting upset about it, I'm just not going to buy these comics or support the merchandise. And yes, I did have a grieving process as related to DC Comics, in that I was really angry about what Dan Didio did to DC Comics, and I was very angry about what Kathleen Kennedy did to Star Wars and the iconic characters of Star Wars, like killing Han Solo and turning Luke Skywalker into a character that was completely out of character for himself, turning Princess Leia into a superwoman, and I shudder at what she's going to do to Lando Calrissian, but I know that I cannot get emotional about it, even though these characters were a part of my childhood and a part of me growing up. I just have to realize that they are fictional characters, and as the property of Disney, Disney can do whatever it pleases with them. And as long as I've got my original trilogy DVDs, I can watch those. But as it relates to new Star Wars products and the new direction they want to go in, I'm not going to spend any more money on these new Lucasfilm products as long as Kathleen Kennedy is in charge and as long as Bob Iger continues to support gynocentrism instead of supporting good storytelling. Because when he decided to double down and continue to support Kathleen Kennedy, that showed me that he did not care about Star Wars fans, he did not care about the customers, and he didn't even care about his fellow business associates like Hasbro, which took huge losses on all of that Star Wars merchandise, and even companies like Toys R Us, which went out of business due to all of those horrible Star Wars movies like your Force Awakens, like your Last Jedi, and like Solo, where the merchandise still continues to rot on shelves, even in spite of clearance prices. And if this is the attitude Disney is going to have, then I feel very confident about keeping my wallet in my pocket as related to Star Wars, in the same way I have been keeping my wallet in my pocket as related to DC Comics merchandise over the last 8 to 9 years. Because after your Dan Didio decided to go New 52. I have not bought a single Mattel DC superheroes action figure in any of their lines, like the multiverse, because those lines all feature characters from a universe that I do not consider to be canon. And it's related to Star Wars. I see it the exact same way, and many other comic, sci-fi, fantasy, and manga fans also feel the same way regarding Star Wars. They know at the end of the day, yes, we have an emotional attachment to these characters. However, what leads to people breaking their emotional attachment after they've gone through the grieving process for these characters is the understanding that we don't own the characters, we do not own any of the properties, and since these are not our characters and they don't tell the stories we want to see, at the end of the day, it is our dollars that enable companies like Disney to be in business. And if this is my money, then I have a right to spend it on whatever I please. And if this product does not please me, then I don't have to spend money on this. This is where Bob Iger and Kathleen Kennedy have it twisted. They believe because they have the Star Wars property, people are dependent on Star Wars, but the only thing people are really dependent on are inelastic goods like toilet paper and water, because those are essentials. Star Wars is not an essential, and if a product like Star Wars is not meeting the customer standard, the customer can choose not to buy that product and put their support behind another product. And this is what I urge many Star Wars fans, sci-fi fans, and fantasy fans to do, is go out here and support many of the independent creators like myself and many others out here and help us build science fiction and fantasy franchises, because guys like me, what I want to do is give my customers the very best. I want to give them the best in terms of story. I want to give them the very best in the terms of character development. And I want to listen to my audience when they tell me something is wrong and something doesn't work out. Instead of doubling down and insisting on going the direction I want to go in, I want to listen to my customers and give them exactly what they want. And when Disney's CEO Bob Iger decided to double down and retain Kathleen Kennedy, all he did was throw up a middle finger up at every Star Wars fan across this globe, show them that he did not respect their wishes, he did not respect their opinions on Star Wars, and he did not care about their money, because Disney believes that because they control so much intellectual property that they don't have to respect the customer. And that's a huge mistake, because just like you own all this property, you can lose all that property because it takes the customer's money to keep you in business and keep you afloat. So that's why it's very important to make sure that your customer bases are happy. And as I see it, Bob Iger is taking his customers for granted. He is not showing them the respect that they deserve, and he does not value their dollars. As someone who owns a publishing company, I value my customers, I respect my customers, and I know how hard it is to work for their money. But this is something your Bob Iger doesn't understand, and that's why he's keeping Kathleen Kennedy on his payroll in spite of her completely disastrous performance as the head of Lucasfilm. It's clear, based on her business decisions, that she is not qualified to be the head of Lucasfilm, and keeping her in that position because you want to win brownie points in the diversity game is going to cost Disney in the long game. And I doubt that Kathleen Kennedy is going to come out here and defend Bob Iger from the corporate board of directors when Disney has a downturn due to Star Wars and possibly the complete collapse of Marvel Studios. And when that's something Bob Iger really isn't thinking about in his attempts to white knight for Kathleen Kennedy, because him white knighting for Kathleen Kennedy gives her a shield to stand behind without having to take account for what she went out here and did. And I thought that that was one of the principles of feminism, was that a woman who wanted to have equal power would take equal responsibility when given that power. Because Kathleen Kennedy wanted power over Lucasfilm, she wanted power over the Star Wars franchise, and she wanted to push a feminist agenda in Star Wars. However, when it's time for Kathleen Kennedy to take account for her actions, she runs and hides behind White Knight Bob Iger. And White Knight Bob Iger, what he does is give her a pass for her failure, and he gives her that pass because he is gynocentric. And as a gynocentrist, he, instead of saying that, Kathleen Kennedy was in charge, she was responsible, and because she did so poorly based on her performance, needs to be terminated, instead, he blames it on releasing too many movies. And that deflection just, again, doesn't work, because when we look at the box office for Rogue One was strong, but what really led to the collapse of Star Wars was the lukewarm reception to Force Awakens and the complete collapse of Last Jedi and Solo, a Star Wars story, because those stories weren't thinking about focusing on the history and the lore of the characters. It was all about pushing identity politics, like having Rey be this super strong heroine who can do things with the Force that no one could do without any training, or having Lando Calrissian being revealed as a pansexual to appeal to an audience that just did not exist. And this is why Star Wars is in the sad state of affairs that it's in. And if Star Wars doesn't want to get itself together, then I say comic, sci-fi, and fantasy fans, again, need to vote with their wallets, take their money elsewhere, and go out here and support independent comic creators, independent sci-fi and fantasy creators, and turn those franchises into hits, because at the end of the day, it is the customer's choice, and the customer who has the dollars has the power at the end of the day to make some other franchise a phenomenon and go out here and be a part of that fantasy lore. And that's something that many people really need to think about, because it is the fans that make something a phenomenon. It is the fans that make something popular, and it's the fans that make something into a pop culture icon. Because if you're Bob Iger and Kathleen Kennedy don't want to support those fans, then they don't deserve the money. And that's something fans really need to think about, because at the end of the day, you are the one with the power, you are the one in control, and you were the one who made Star Wars into a pop culture phenomenon. And if Kathleen Kennedy and Bob Iger don't want to respect you or your money, you can go, make some other franchise and some other creator like myself the next pop culture phenomenon, and make the creator like myself into the next George Lucas. You have that power, and you can do this easily because it is your money and your support that made Star Wars what it is, and you can make something else the same type of pop culture phenomenon as well. That's what I want people to understand at the end of the day. You are the one with the power, and you don't have to buy a product that does not meet your standard. If your Bob Iger wants to keep Kathleen Kennedy on and wants to keep her running Lucasfilm, you can walk away from Star Wars and walk towards independent creators like myself, who would be eager to have your money and eager to give you products that meet your standard and will entertain you and your family and be something that you would want to share with others. That's something I want to do as a publisher. That's something I want to do as a creator, and that's something that your Bob Iger and your Kathleen Kennedy have lost track of because they've become completely disconnected and disengaged from the audience, and they're not listening to the customer. They're so in their echo chamber than listening to themselves that they can't see the damage they've done to Star Wars in completely tarnishing a iconic pop culture iconic brand. If you'd like to try some of my SJS Direct publications, like the ISIS series, the Eastine series, the John Haynes series, The Temptation of John Haynes, and the Spinsterella trilogy, you may do so by clicking the link in the description box to Amazon.com. And if you want to help me make more videos like this, you can donate to my Patreon by clicking the link in the description box. That's all I have to say for this video. You can comment, rate, and subscribe. Now available in paperback and Kindle Unlimited, ISIS, Escape from Transylvania. The goddess next door and John Haynes must escape a horde of vampires on the hunt in this horror-filled ISIS series adventure. Get ISIS, Escape from Transylvania in paperback and Kindle Unlimited today.